Welcome back to Face the State. I'm Ariana Bennett. Thank you for staying with us. Well, the First Amendment guarantees our right to free speech, press, religion, peaceable assembly. And while it's pretty simple in concept, that doesn't mean there aren't limits and potential consequences when we exercise these rights. So, how do we know where the line is? Shannon Pierce, attorney with Fenimore Craig, is here now to fill us in on this. Shannon, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, now I think the First Amendment, first and second probably are the most well-known of the amendments, but do you think that it's well understood?
Yes and no. Everybody seems to understand that there is a freedom of speech, but I think sometimes we forget who that is meant to protect us against. So the freedom of speech that's in the First Amendment is meant to protect us from governmental consequences for choosing to voice our opinions. But in the private environment, such as in a workplace, there is no First Amendment right.
Right. So to draw an example, if you were in a monarchy, for example, and you spoke out against the king, that would be necessarily or potentially cause for treason, right? And you could be imprisoned or beheaded for something like that. In America, the government cannot punish you for speaking out, right? But it does not protect you from social consequences, right? Like you mentioned, workplace or just in life. And we saw this play out very recently with this march of white supremacists in Charlottesville, where they're out, expressing their free speech, and they're legally allowed to do that, correct?
Yes, as long as it's done within the limits. When you cross the line into committing criminal conduct, inciting violence, defaming somebody, defrauding somebody, those are examples of crossing the line where you lose your First Amendment protection. But to stand out on a street corner and express hate speech is protected, which makes sense to us if you think about it, because speech is only free if we allow speech that we don't like.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I think it's important, like you mentioned, the limitations. So specific limitations on our freedom of speech are inciting violence,
correct,
threats, slander and libel, things that I have to worry about in news, obscenity, things like child pornography. So it's not absolute.
That's
and
right.
important to remember that you can't just go out in public and say whatever you want.
Yeah, as long as you stay on the right side of the line of it. Expressing your views, absolutely. Crossing the line into hurting somebody, threatening to hurt somebody, or ruining somebody's name, that's where you get into trouble.
And it gets a little blurry, I think, when we're talking about public versus private consequences. So while the government necessarily can't put you in jail for participating in the Charlottesville marches, that doesn't mean that you are protected from when you go home and your employer might not want to keep you around anymore. And that's kind of one of the important things that we wanted to discuss on this episode is what are the employer's rights, employees' rights, and how do you know where you stand?
Well, and I'm glad you said employers' rights. I'm a defense attorney, so I'm a big believer in employers' rights. But the answer is it's complicated. And here's why. I mean, we start from a starting point of Nevada is an at-will state. So I, as your employer, can fire you for any reason I want as long as that reason doesn't violate the law. I give the classic example of if I don't like the color of your shoelaces, I can fire you for that reason. But the at-will doctrine gets limited when we say that there are public policies that deserve equal importance. So that's why even though we're in an at-will state, employers can't discriminate against people based on their race, their religion, their national origin, things like that. Nevada also has a statute that says that we can't discriminate against employees on the basis of political activity. When it comes to an employee who on their own time has engaged in hate speech, for example, it's complicated as to whether or not the employer can fire the employee for doing that. And we've seen a couple recent examples in the news where employers have done just that. Uno's Pizzeria fired somebody who attended the Charlottesville rally, whereas the university decided not to fire the student who had an on-campus job for the very same thing. The things that the employers need to think about when deciding whether or not to take action against an employee who is engaged in hate speech, I like to think of it as the acronym NPR. N stands for National Labor Relations Act. If the employee is engaging in protected concerted activity where they're complaining about wages, they're complaining about working conditions, that's something that can be protected. We saw that in the news a couple months ago with Google. You might remember the Google employee who wrote a memo criticizing diversity measures. after he was fired, he turned around and filed a complaint saying that the National Labor Relations Act had been violated. The R in NPR stands for religion, and for this I like to think of the Westboro Baptist Church. If somebody is a member of that church and as part of their religious activities are expressing hate speech against, for example, gay and lesbian individuals, if the employer fires the individual for having done that on their off time, the employer could potentially be sued for discrimination on the basis of religion. Not to say the employee would win that case, but you could see that kind of claim.
Interesting. Okay, so what if we go a little bit more into the gray area where we're talking about issues that are a little bit less black and white? So, you know, we have white supremacy is a generally unpopular position to take. It's pretty extreme and not extremely common. But what if we're talking about participation in something like the Women's March, or a gay pride parade, or say a pro-life demonstration, or something along those lines? Is that a fireable offense?
I would say it would be risky to fire somebody for attending a gay pride parade. The obvious claim that you might get from that is that you are firing somebody because you don't approve of their choice of lifestyle. And in Nevada, sexual orientation is one of the categories that we protect when we say we don't discriminate against those bases. Similarly, with women's rights, if you're going to a pro-women's march and you're fired for that, that could be grounds for gender discrimination. So employers should think carefully before they take action based on those examples.
What about just political positions, like being pro-choice, pro-life?
That's an area that we don't know yet. So as I said, Nevada has a statute that says that we don't discriminate against people for political activity, but we have not yet had a case that defines political activity. So if you're running for office, that's pretty clearly an example of political activity. You shouldn't be fired for that. But just expressing your political views, is that political activity? We don't know yet.
Interesting. So how does one behave then, not really knowing what exactly is protected based on court precedent? What would your advice be to a politically passionate person?
I would suggest that that person limit those types of activities to outside the workplace. Because if your political beliefs cause you to create a hostile work environment for somebody else that's one of your coworkers, you may have crossed the line into a fireable offense. Let me give you an example. I'm a devout Christian, and I firmly believe in the right of people to choose their own lifestyle, but what if I was not that kind of Christian? I was the kind of Christian who did not believe in gay rights. I would not want to go into a workplace and start picking on my gay coworkers just because of my religious beliefs. That will get me fired. Whereas if I do it on my off time, it's less and less the employer's business.
Okay, that makes sense. So in the case of these marchers in Charlottesville, the UNR student who participated in that came back and there were petitions that he should be fired, and the university decided not to fire him. But could the university have done it legally?
You know, I think that's an interesting issue. Because the university receives government funds, I think that the First Amendment rights could potentially kick in. It's a different example than if it's, say, Uno's Pizzeria, that is a private entity. Private entities are not subject to First Amendment restrictions.
So if he had worked for just a business in Reno that wasn't university related, then he could have been fired?
He could have been, and if he could try to turn it into a claim of political discrimination, religious discrimination, or a violation of the National Labor Relations Act, that NPR that I mentioned, then potentially he could have a claim.
But we kind of have to wait and see if someone's going to do that so it can get nailed down. Obviously, until there's a court case, we don't know.
Yeah, and that leaves businesses in somewhat of a tough spot. And businesses just don't know, can they take action against people for the views they express outside of work? You take somebody like a white supremacist. If a white supremacist keeps their views to themselves at the workplace, and yet they are national news over the fact that they attended a white supremacist rally, their African-American colleagues could be very uncomfortable around them. What does the employer do in that context? It's a very tough call, and I recommend that businesses consult with their counsel before taking actions.
So caution on both sides then would be your advice.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we just have a little bit of time left. Do you have any last bits of wisdom for us?
Call your lawyer.
Call your lawyer. It's good. It's like a commercial that the phone number pops up on the screen.
Exactly.
All right, Shannon. Thank you so much for your time. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Alrighty, that's it for this episode of Face the State. But for more information or to see past episodes, you can just head to our website. That's ktvn.com. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you next week.